So good evening, everybody. And thank you, Anne, for the great introduction, and thank you all for attending. So in line with the mic, in line with the camera. So and as Anne mentioned, my name is Rehema Msulwa, and I am an associate professor in major program management at Said Business School. I'm also a Hugh Price Fellow at Jesus College. About me, so I'm from Tanzania, the best country in East Africa. I don't make the rules. But from a research perspective, really my research considers two overarching questions. I think about how collective decisions are made in the context of projects and programs, and then how the process of developing major infrastructure programs is governed, right? So my research journey can be thought of in terms of pre-2012 and post-2012. Pre-2012, I was based in South Africa, training in applied economics. I studied at the University of Cape Town, and in my final year, worked with an economic geographer at the Human Sciences Research Council, which is South Africa's statutory research body, looking at the spatial implications of agglomeration in South Africa. So essentially that is thinking about spatial inequality, so location-based inequality in South Africa, and a big part of the South African story is apartheid and spatial engineering under apartheid, right? So the legacy of that can still be seen in the country today. Post-2012, coming to Manchester, I thought, okay, I have a sense of how to define the problem. What are the mechanisms for addressing it or for addressing them? One of those is the management and implementation of projects and programs, at least I thought at the time. And so I said, okay, I'll go to Manchester, study this, get all the answers, go back, solve all the problems, right? So that didn't happen. Essentially, what's happened over time is I have very many more questions than answers. So my research is really at the nexus of that policy meets management, or policy meets the implementation of projects and programs. And since pre-2012, I've looked at the management of programs and projects across multiple sectors. So transport, electricity, water, and digital. I should say primarily in the UK, but with lessons and applications that are relevant for the continent. So in the presentation today, I will talk about mega infrastructure programs and projects, and sort of locate them for you in the literature. I'll talk about governance, the importance of governance and the multiple levels of governance that occur in large-scale programs. I'll then talk about institutions and institutional change, how governance relates to institutions and institutional change, why the rules of the game, so to speak, are important, and then begin to talk about potential for further research and conclude by bringing it all together. So there are a lot of parts to the presentation. It's in part work that I've done, but also thinking out loud. So if you are lost at any point, we are in this together. I will try to bring it all together at the end, and if I can't, then we'll go through the questions and answers and figure it out there. So major infrastructure projects and programs, what are they? So there are a number of definitions in the literature, but mega projects are generally defined as large-scale, multi-year ventures, costly, over £1 billion, that have a transformative impact on society. So in terms of a road, for example, we're not thinking about fixing potholes in a road or fixing a road in order to make marginal changes. We're thinking, for example, about building a network of roads that will change the way the economy works, right? Think about in the South African case, when I said spatial engineering, infrastructure can really change the distribution of demand and supply within a system. Major programs, and this is an emerging definition, are in a sense multiple projects that make up a program, right? So temporary and distributed organizations, multiple projects, multiple organizations come together. Future-oriented, so present day of execution for unpredictable, often extreme case futures. So think about programs and projects around space and the space economy at the moment, right? This is multiple organizations in different countries, in different places, thinking about how to navigate this landscape. And I should say, Daniel Lamanius and Mark Ventresca, who are cited here, are active in the space and are colleagues in the business school. Engagement mandates in major programs means that we have to work with historically marginalized groups across various political and community realities and histories. The scale is so large that it has to be inclusive, right? The impacts are potentially so transformative, and transformative both for the positive and the negative. So it could be to the benefits of some and the detriment of others, and therefore otherwise marginalized communities have to be considered, including nature, right? We have to consider the impact on nature in a way, particularly in the context of sustainability, that we haven't necessarily had to before. And then there is never enough money. So major programs and mega projects are completed increasingly in the context of constrained resources. Right. So what does that have to do with Africa? So the African continent, across the continent, countries and cities have major infrastructure gaps. The African Development estimates that the continent will need between 130 and 170 billion dollars for infrastructure development per year, right? So if we say a mega project is £1 billion, then we're talking £1 billion, $1 billion, then we're talking multiple projects a year over time to fill this gap. This gap stands, but then it's also further exacerbated by things like climate change, by rapid urbanization, by the historical underinvestment in infrastructure by both governments and the private sector, and then by poor governance, corruption, and conflict, right? So it's dynamic, and some forces can widen the gap in ways that obviously are undesirable. So if we look, for example, at the pictures on the screen, both of those pictures are Durban. Durban is a city in South Africa. So the top one is an aerial view of part of Durban that shows the stark inequality that exists, right? You have on the one side, a suburb, gardens, swimming pools, big houses, and on the other side, you have an informal settlement. An informal settlement, very dense, lack of public services, all the problems we've described. So already there is a need for infrastructure in that context. Add to that then, the bottom picture is flooding that happened in Durban in 2018, and we exacerbate the problem. So now not only do we need to address already existing inequalities, we also need to ensure that the infrastructure that we do put in place is resilient to climate change. And then on top of that is the question of who do we build the infrastructure for, right? Because in the case of flooding, both sides of the top picture will need infrastructure, but where will it actually go? So essentially infrastructure is important because it's a binding constraint, both for economic growth, for economic development, but also it plays a key role in all three dimensions of sustainable development. So it's the economy, it's the social, it's the environment. So some examples of infrastructure projects. In the top, there's Nachtigal, which is a hydropower project currently, under construction in Cameroon. The idea here is that once the project is built, it will increase access to electricity in Cameroon by about 20% or 25%. It is, right, and then there's the Gautrain in South Africa, which was the largest PPP or public-private partnership on the continent when it was built, that connects Pretoria, the administrative capital of South Africa, to Johannesburg, the economic capital, and the international airport. The idea here was that it would reduce congestion on the roads by about 20%. So again, a significant impact. On the bottom, my bottom left, there's, or which would be your bottom, I'm trying to figure it out. So, okay, then there's the BRT in Nigeria. And this was the first BRT on the African continent that essentially is called BRT Light, or was called BRT Light, because it didn't have all the specifications of a BRT system elsewhere. The aim was really to ensure delivery, ensure affordability and safety for Lagosians, right? So, and then you have the Starlink, which is the map, the final picture, and this is essentially, Starlink is a broadband company owned by SpaceX, or run by SpaceX in the US, Elon Musk, that promises broadband or competition for broadband across African countries. At the moment, there are multiple countries that have already signed up, I think 8, and potentially many more, right? So this is, in terms of scale, in terms of potential impact, potentially transformative, but also importantly, potentially disruptive to the existing landscape. So given the scale of these projects and programs, it follows that no one organization can implement them or deliver them or develop them on their own. Collective action is necessary. So what happens is then they bring together an array of autonomous, so legally independent organizations that are resource rich, who need to collaborate across organizational boundaries. So somebody might own the land, somebody might own planning permission, and somebody might own financing, and somehow they have to come around the table and figure it out, right? So power to make decisions is diffused, and work processes are knowledge-based. So we're designing and then implementing essentially an infrastructural artifact. Organizational actors from different communities of practice may have conflicting goals. So engineers need to figure out how to collaborate with economists who are interested in value for money, need to figure out how to interact with the financiers or bankers who are interested in the bankability of the project, need to figure out ultimately how to engage with the community at large, right? So the divergent interests that need negotiation in order to come together for collective ends. Because you have multiple autonomous actors, the different organizations or dispute resolution doesn't happen under a hierarchy. So no single organization can dictate what another organization must do, because we are all resource rich, and you don't necessarily have sort of power over my resources, so to speak. So we have to negotiate, right? So it has to be consensus-oriented, polycentric, which I will explain in a minute, collective action. So polycentricity essentially means governance has to occur over multiple levels of decision-making. And this is also in part given the scale of infrastructure projects. So you have the legislative, the policy regulation, the program, the communities, and the physical world. At the level of the project, for example, you have to make sure that you're abiding by the law, you're aligned with policy, etc. You have to make sure that you're taking the interests of the communities into account. if your project is to be effective, right? It's possible that you can do without, for example, taking the communities into account, but as we'll see in an example that follows, they can ultimately disrupt your project. So it's in your interest to have everybody around the table and to negotiate or to aim for at least consensus. Part of that is by trying to align information, which in my research comes down to interorganizational technical working groups. So engineers from the different organizations or multiple technical people from the different organizations come together and discuss. A lot of documentation. So a lot of the reports we see online about projects, part of it is about sensitizing the project community and the wider community about the project. There's also an alignment of interest that goes beyond information. So you have multiple levels of decision-making forums. So you might have a strategic board, you might have a program board that meets ever so frequently that then reports to the strategic board for their decisions to be made. There's also negotiating resource boundaries because, as we said in the beginning, resources are constrained, and part of that can be an appeal to fairness. So, example, Nachtigal, the governance structure, you have the board of directors here, and the different colors are the different organizations sitting on the board that represent different interests. Importantly, so you have, for example, the IFC, you have EDF, which is the France's utility company, you have Cameroon government, you have Africa 50, which is an African investment platform, and you have STOA, which are impact investors. In some way, the representation on the board represents an equity, the equity stake in the project. But beyond that, you also have debt financiers who are not on the board of directors, but are still influential. Obviously, you have to keep your creditors happy. Even beyond that, you have communities who have to be consulted or who are consulted in line with national legislation and IFC performance standards in this regard, and who can exert their influence, right? So it's not just we engage them or we consult with them for the sake of it. In this case, civil society groups on behalf of these communities filed a complaint against the World Bank for disruption, inadequate compensation, and insufficient consultation, right? And unless that is addressed sufficiently, there can be stalls in the project. So the rules of the game matter. And by the rules of the game, we're talking about institutions. And these are formal rules, your constitutions, law, property rights, budgetary restrictions, but also informal constraints, including customs and tradition. The challenge, however, is that within the research landscape, so this is making the case for more research, the assumption is that the formal environment is fixed. So I'm going to go through this very quickly because of time, but the assumption is that institutions are fixed. So institutions are either good or bad. If they are good, we go ahead with the capital investment. If they are bad, we consider capital investment or building institutions. So we build institutions first, and then we build the capital or build the infrastructure later, right? So it's a sequential process. There's an organizational duality that then arises, where you have some organizations, particularly the World Bank and countries under the OECD Development Assistance Committee, will want to build institutions before they build the infrastructure, right? You have others, for example, the Chinese, if we consider the duality between building institutions and capital investment, the Chinese might say, our investment is not tied to government's ideals, therefore, the institutional environment is murky, we'll go ahead and build anyway. Both have pros and cons, but a discussion of those is sort of beyond the scope of the presentation. An example of that is in the context of the Lagos Urban Transport Project. So this was a program launched by the Lagos government in 2000, and in terms of long-term policy and strategy for public transportation in Lagos. Before capital investment. The World Bank said we will build, it was supported by the World Bank, I should say, and the French Development Agency. Before capital investment, the World Bank said, let's build capacity. So they developed a local transport institution, reformed the transport system, including passing law that would allow this transport institution called LAMATA to plan, regulate, and coordinate the supply of public transport. And then they also passed BRT regulation. Post that, they said, let's develop a master strategic plan. So they developed a master strategic plan, which was 9 BRT networks, 7 rail lines, numerous ferry routes, and numerous road projects, right? So we've built the capacity, we've prepared the institutional environment, we have a strategic plan, now capital investment, and the World Bank supported a BRT corridor, right? So this is essentially what the program looked like. Very vast lines representing multiple modes of transport. There was also, for LAMATA, the agency that was created, rail was a priority, but the World Bank said rail is sort of ruled out for us. The institutions are not necessarily ready, and BRTs and the Red Line, a line which was already underway, would do more for poverty alleviation. LAMATA then forged deals with Chinese lenders and Chinese contractors who essentially went ahead and built the project, right? So governance ideals are not part of our investment decisions, so to speak. So we go ahead and build the project. In the end, there were issues along the way, as we would expect. But what this does is highlight the two different approaches to infrastructure development. There is a potential third, areas for potential further research, which is what if it's not about the duality? It doesn't have to be a sequential process of developing infrastructure. What if we build those concurrently, right? So what if we develop the infrastructure while building the infrastructure, while building the institutions? Is there evidence of that? Yes. I say confidently because I have a paper that says that, and a case study that's basically in the UK, where there's a project called the Thames Tideway Tunnel that was essentially to upgrade the sewers under the Thames River because there was sewage going into the river. To do that, however, essentially the project would need a parallel regulatory framework where the project wouldn't be delivered by an existing utility, but would be delivered by a company that was specifically created for that. And with that, law was passed to then allow for the creation of this organization or the regulation of this organization, so parallel to or separate to the existing regulatory framework. Also in South Africa with the Gautrain, there wasn't provision for local or subnational railway delivery, and with that law was passed to do that. Very quickly, because Anne is looking at me. So projects can trigger or can be a mechanism through which laws are changed or the institution is changed, but also this is not always successful. We see, for example, in the case of the Kampala and Tebe Expressway in Uganda, which went live in, I think, 2018. An MOU was signed between the Chinese and Uganda, but there were delays in land acquisition. To get around this, the Ugandan government considered changing the 1998 land law, which essentially through both traditional and legislative means puts land in the hands of the citizens, right? So the government cannot take the land, let's say, unless a fair price has been reached in the courts. The courts presented a price, government said this is too expensive for us. The courts didn't have capacity to manage the disputes. So government tried to change the laws, but then this was blocked by stakeholders, including the Baganda Kingdom. You have the newspaper clipping on the slide that says the Kabaka, which is the king, opposes land amendment bill, right? So institutional change can happen through projects, but the process is neither costless nor frictionless, and it is not guaranteed. So very quickly, why is this important? Africa has a large infrastructure gap. We established that. And so even if this gap isn't filled by the 130 to 170 billion a year that's required, there will be a lot of activity in this space over time. Infrastructure projects and programs are transformational. So we already said that they can reconfigure economic activity to the benefit of some and to the detriment of others. Institutional change, whether independently or concurrently, can further entrench any changes from a project or program into the system for a long time to come. So in the case of Uganda, for example, the Kabaka and the Baganda Kingdom said, we don't want to change the laws because of what this could mean for future generations, right? If the government can take land without fair court-ordered compensation. And so in terms of governance, what's important and what's an area of potential research is to understand who are the decision makers, both formal and informal. What are the structures and processes adopted to facilitate collective action? So we saw the board of directors, we spoke about strategic boards, their processes of consulting with communities. But I think perhaps what's underappreciated in the literature at the moment is what is the scope of the decisions that they are making. So governance, those involved in decision-making are not just making decisions that are constrained to the project, they are potentially changing institutions and with implications for way longer or beyond the scope of what we are all considering in the moment. And that's me, thank you.
Clearly, it's not as big as fixing my roof. Thank you, Rehema. It's very riveting and it's very interesting, and I bet the next one will be as interesting and equally fascinating. So our next speaker, there will be time for questions at the end of this, I promise. So I'm sure you're listing them all, and Rehema will be here on the firing line at the end of the next talk. And I forgot in the beginning to say a warm welcome to those who are joining us online. Please keep posting your questions online. We will be able to get to them as well at the end of the discussion. So our next speaker is Tinashe. I'm delighted to welcome Tinashe, who's a research fellow in African and Comparative Literature at St. Anne's College. His research looks at everything from literary cultures, archives, translation, and African and diaspora literatures. So delighted, and if you could join me in welcoming Tinashe to speak.
It was not my plan that you have to look at my image for talk, but it is what it is. So thank you for coming. I'm talking about what I call archivization and the idea of Africa. And archivization is the process of selecting records for retention in an archive and preparing them for research use. I'm here to talk about what has been archived and or encountering, fighting, engaging, refusing what is archived. So I'm a Zimbabwe-born citizen of the world. I studied literature, journalism, and creative writing. My passport book describes me as a writer, a description that I felt as an 18-year-old encapsulated my being. I've maintained it with every subsequent renewal of the document, despite the various roles I've occupied. Often when I have traveled to a new country, a new foreign country, the immigration officers ask me, who are you? What do you do? And the word writer always piques their interest. So bear with me. I've no slides. I've weaved them into this tapestry of words and worlds. It's apt to follow a talk about infrastructure and development. Sometimes when people ask me what I do in Oxford, I answer in jest. I say I'm into infrastructure building. And by that I mean I'm interested in systems, structures, processes that constitute the archived, and how they are used in knowledge production, in the curriculum and pedagogy, in formulating policy and law. I'm interested in the materiality of history and ideas, in affect and anecdote. I arrived at the archival after my PhD. Before that, my training was interpretive, theoretical. It was secondary reading, explanatory. The source was always so far away, removed, displaced, inconceivable, hidden, even if the subject was about myself, my country, my continent, an aspect of my culture or identity. The tyranny of the book and the mystery of authorship was communicated as authoritative and unimpeachable. My interest in archives is not just material, but also relational, epistemic, and a way of reading and being in history. So I'm in the business of making and publishing and sharing interference archives. I try to locate or create mirror archives as an act of reading and writing and thinking and interpreting. And the next line, I say that I do not theorize the North-South divide, partly because the archives I'm referencing are very much outside the continent. So I do not just theorize the North-South divide, I live it and I engage it in all my work. I mention North-South because for the rest of my life, I'll be constantly negotiating this duality of being here, of being there, of being nowhere. So consider this talk as a meditation, an invitation, a provocation, a convocation. As I reflected on my contribution this evening, I decided to rewind the clock and think about my own education as I wonder who are the people I'm encountering in archives and books. I've had the privilege to live across time, place, and temporalities. I live between, at, into, or across spaces, separating objects, places, regions, geographies. The comparative is not just epistemological or methodology. It is a way of being, a daily negotiation of becoming and unbecoming. In order for me to write my own history, I sadly have to rely on the colonial archive, which means my horizons are limited as I'm expected to see as far as the sources. But whose archive? What archive? I'm learning to be skeptical of references, citation, acknowledgements, labels. What are these sources? Whose sources? A primary source is a first-hand or contemporary account of an event or topic. Primary sources are supposed to be the most direct evidence of a time or event because they were created by people or things that were there at the time or event. These sources are supposed to offer original thought and have not been modified by interpretation. So consequently, before interpretation or analysis, there are already questions of orthography, especially if we're thinking about African archives in quotes. There are already questions of orthography, language, perspective, translation, and meaning. So imagine when I discovered a few years ago that in the state where Ron DeSantis governs, in the basements and off-storage facilities of the University of Florida, is one of the biggest archives of the Shona language. Yes, in order to understand the history of Shona as a pedagogical subject, as a knowledge construct, Florida's archives offer some clues. The archive even includes ethnographic recordings of children singing rhymes in 1924. Being transported to Black Zimbabwean childhoods 100 years ago is surreal. As I listen to these voices of children, of my ancestors, I'm fascinated and yet disturbed by how even when people are audible, loud, distinct, they can still be anonymized into cultural curiosities. As Valentin Mudimbe puts it in The Idea of Africa, these anonymous people were often described as the savage, faceless, colorless, and sometimes voiceless. And as an African living today, a large part of my identity, cultural knowledge, and inherited material wisdom is held behind walls by institutions who see and define these objects merely as items of antiquity and no longer of utility. So what is my relationship to this ethnologic body of materials? What is history? What use is history? Whose history? What use is memory? Who are the people making history? What is the value of history? The concept that drives my research interests is the imagination, or maybe sometimes what Sally Hartman calls critical fabulation, which highlights the symbiosis between the process of history and its products, like memory and the nation. The thing remembered is plainly identified with a singular and repeatable event. As Margaret Atwood observes, the past no longer belongs only to those who lived it. The past belongs to those who claim it, and are willing to exploit and to infuse it with meaning for those alive today. The past belongs to us because we are the ones who need it. But is it that simple? After a few years of trekking and tracing archives, especially about Zimbabwe, I've started asking myself, what ideas of Africa am I claiming? Or perhaps I should look at it like this. When you were never meant to survive, imagining yourself by reclaiming the future space is a radical act. As I sit in the archives looking at old historical documents in Oxford, I'm beginning to realize that what I'm yearning for is not there. It is beyond the classically historical boundaries in terms of references and texts, the immaterial archive. And the immaterial archive refers to the intangible quality of affects, dreams, spirits, and visions. Are these phenomena nothing or something or nothing? Do they have substance or belong to the insubstantial and unsubstantiated realm of the imagination? I wonder about this because in those crucial moments of encounter, of clashes and war, for example, in 1896, of the Matebele revolt, as an example, there's no record of the Ndebele warriors talking about the experience of this war. Everything is in reported speech. Everything is translated or interpreted. Everything is in summary. So summarizing another's experience of the same event. The Ndebele warriors have no names, no personalities beyond their group identity. And yet the English generals, all of them have glorious titles, remembered and recognized with their full names, their village heads, their chiefs, everything. As recorders of history, because the archive is built from their letters, diaries, memorandums, wills. How is this African history when the African is not speaking in turn, is not being interpreted? Mutimba explains it this way. Telling stories is a way of disarticulating an author's pretensions, as well as of reformulating the supposed logical derivations of even a mathematical demonstration. In effect, the story organizes its own basis, operations, objectives, and anticipations. The master of the storytelling performance is in the listener, who when bored can stop at any time or simply cease to listen. I made the archives to map out stories, narratives, plots, characters, heroes, and villains. Yet the African is fixed, and Africa is a place of negative extremes. Africa finds meaning with the arrival of colonies, of immigrants from elsewhere. Even in the 21st century, isn't it strange that nothing much has changed? This is what prompts Binyalanga Wanaina to write this memo, how to write about Africa. Always use the word Africa, or darkness, or safari in your title. Subtitles may include the words Zanzibar, Masai, Zulu, Zambezi, Congo, Nile, big, sky, shadow, drum, sun, or bygone. Also useful are words such as guerrillas, timeless, primordial, and tribal. Note that people means Africans who are not black, while the people means Black Africans. Never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book, or in it unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. An AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breasts. Use these. If you must include an African, make sure you get one in Maasai, or Zulu, or Dogon dress. In your text, treat Africa as if it were one country. It is hot and dusty with rolling grasslands, huge heads of animals and tall, thin people who are starving? Or is it hot and steamy with very short people who eat primates? Don't get bogged down with precise descriptions. Africa is big. 54 countries, 900 million people who are too busy starving and dying and wearing and emigrating to read your book. The continent is full of deserts, jungles, highlands, savannas, and many other things. But your reader doesn't care about all of that. So keep your descriptions romantic and evocative and unparticular. Yeah, anyway, so this was Binabanga, and Ezekiel Mpahlele in his book, The African Image, asks a question: what is the African literary image of himself? We are dealing here with the African who emerges as a writer because of the presence of the white man, sometimes in spite of it, who brought formal classroom education with him. So in the words of Phil Winsor and Benedicta Savoy, the restitution of African heritage entails a precise knowledge of African collections. So the debate about restitution and return of objects, which is to say, in the words of Phil Winsor and Benedict Savoy, the restitution of African heritage entails a precise knowledge of African collections, which is to say, of knowing where and what they are. Sarr and Savoy are here talking about cultural objects, the loot in European and American museums. James Laurie writes, of all the displaced things contemplated by this global system, the least evident and perhaps the least vivid in the popular imagination are the archives, which some have argued lack the financial value of looted art, the representational potency of monuments or buildings, or the aesthetic value of objects displayed in museums. Perhaps the archives, the African archives, in the Bodleian or any other institution, are a false trail. Africa has since been time immemorial been narrated into existence. By whom and for what ends? Is history cause and effect? Is history invention? Is history make-believe? The motives of African colonialism were varied and many, but one of its major contributions was to curate Africa as a paradigm of difference. I'm invested in, and so is many of you, in investigating, examining, disturbing the authority of the archive, its sources, its perspectives, its methods, and its authors. Thank you.
I'm sure you all got more than you bargained for today. Yeah? That's where you have, that's what you get when you bring two intellectuals head to head. And more than that, in very different spheres, but still finding a thread within the story of who writes the story of Africa. I'm really delighted. Please join me again in saying a big thank you to both of them. Natasha, that was a wild ride. Thank you. And Rehema, thank you for bringing all those questions to perspective and thinking about them in tangible ways on the ground and using some relevant examples from recent, projects across the continent. So there's room now for lots of your questions. There will be revolving mics, so feel free to lift your hand. Yes, well, we get the mics round. There's one here, there's a question there, there's another question. Let's start with the first three, 1, 2, 3, and then, yes. And then we bring the mics to the front, yeah? And as you move around, please, we have a culture in Insaka. If it's not a question and it's a comment, leave it for the drinks. Yeah? If it's not a question and it's a comment, leave it for the drinks. Thank you. So make it brief so we can get through many. And we've got, if you're online, if you're joining us online, please feel free to post them. I've got some of the questions here and I will ask them after this first round of questions. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Umar Zomre and I'm from Burkina Faso, West Africa. So I have questions for you both. The first question will be on infrastructure. You just mentioned during your presentation China. And how do you see this China infrastructure investment through the Silk Road in Africa? To what extent can it be a kind of danger or jeopardizing the sovereignty of our countries? And the second question is about the corruption that you've mentioned as well. So we know that corruption is very endemic in Africa. So to what level top and bottom corruption affect the infrastructures development in Africa? And the question for the archives. So we know that our different countries independent for more than 40 years. So it seems that archives is still problematic in Africa. So according to you, what can explain the fact that most African countries are not investing a lot in archives? Is it about this orality, a tradition that we have?
Could I ask the next one to ask one question, please?
Okay.
Just for the benefit of everybody else. Thank you. There's a question in the middle here and then one at the end there. Sorry. I think Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
No.
Yeah.
Hello.
Oh.
Thank you so much for all your insights. I wonder whether there is any role of translation of ideas from, so to speak, North to African context and vice versa, especially considering the topics we just discussed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A great conversation. My question would be on infrastructure as well. I'm thinking in your experience relating with infrastructure in Africa, what would you say about what are the forms of negotiation of digital infrastructure development in Africa, particularly the rise of geopolitics when it comes to, let's say, AI development, for example? How do you think the investment of, let's say, China, for example, in Africa is going to affect the digital sovereignty plan of Africa at large? Thank you.
All right, we'll take those first to spare the brains of our speakers, and then we'll do the next round of questions from this side. Thank you.
So I think the first question and the last question were somewhat related in terms of China's role and the rising role of China in African infrastructure development. I would say for the African continent, it's an opportunity, right? It brings forward competition in terms of the availability of financing. We have a large infrastructure gap, we have a large financing gap. And so there is an opportunity there that creates competition between your traditional investors, your traditional donors, Chinese investors, and also there is a greater scope for private investment more generally on the African continent, right? What that calls for us then in terms of potential dangers is to develop the capabilities to leverage that competition rather than for it to be sort of exploited, if you will. to our detriment, right? So in the same way with the traditional investment, there's potential to be exploited. With the current rise of Chinese investment, there's potential to be exploited, but there's also great opportunity there. Whether we have the capacity, whether we have the capabilities to leverage the growing sort of private finance landscape will depend on, in some parts, on us.
And then I think there was a question on sovereignty and how the various players affect our sovereignty, especially in the digital space.
Yeah, I think that's, again, where we spoke about governance and thinking about who's making decisions, what decisions are they making, what is the scope of their decisions. I think those are questions that need to be considered, right? So in the context of, for example, Starlink and SpaceX, you're talking about a US-based company with, shall we call it, a gray reputation in the US, right? Potentially coming onto the continent to provide digital infrastructure. Do we have the regulations in place? What do those look like? Who are the decision makers that are creating those regulations? In the US tech space, for example, because the tech companies are more sophisticated in the knowledge about their technology, about what it means, they are in part influencing the regulation and the legislation, right? If that is the same here, then we are at risk. So again, it comes down to the capacity, the capability to be able to exploit opportunities and leverage opportunities rather than being exploited. Corruption up and down, it's a waste of money and it's a waste of time. I think the challenge for many countries across the continent is that we do have large deficits. We don't necessarily have the financial capacity. So these bright, shining infrastructure projects are definitely also an avenue for corruption, right? So then that then speaks to the need for building institutions and for maintaining those institutions, which again, whether we like it or not, comes down to us. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So the question about archives and independence and all of that, I think I've increasingly, all my education has been in English. So obviously I theorize everything in English. And I've been wondering, what is archive in Shona? What is archive in Ndebele? What is archive in all these languages? And I think that's where the problem emanates about the archive. Even if we repatriate these archives about liberation struggles or about our transactional relationship with Europe, even if we bring them back to our African countries, are they still our stories? Because most of our people are not documented their subjects, their objects. They are being classified and analyzed and interpreted, and decisions are being made over them. So I think, part of it is, I guess, is part of what we have to do, most of us in this room, that we have to start figuring out what archives mean. I'm interested in people's stories. So I'm a trained literary scholar. I'm interested in story, in narrative. A couple of years ago, I bought this book, The Corpse Exhibition and Other Stories from Iraq. There's a story I love in this book, which is about a radio station. And I always come back to this story because it gives me an idea of a project that I hope to do one day. So the story is called, I'll just read just a few sentences. The story is called The Song of the Gods, but it doesn't really tell you all of the story. So it opens by saying people were waiting in lines to tell their stories. Memory radio had been set up after the fall of the dictator. From the start, the radio station had adopted a documentary approach to programming, without news bulletins or songs, just documentary reports and programs that delved into the country's past. The station had become famous after announcing that it was going to record a new program titled Their Stories in Their Own Voices. Crowds gathered at the broadcasting center from across the country. The idea was simple: to select best stories and record them as narrated by the people involved, but without mentioning their real names. Then the listeners would choose the top 3 stories, which would win valuable prizes. I guess in other words, I'm also trying to respond to the question about oral history, orature, and the making of archives. I think it's something that needs to be done. And then the question about translation of ideas between North and South, I think it's inevitable. You know, human beings are built to migrate, to transact. So there's always going to be some kind of transaction. There's always going to be some form of assimilation and integration. But I guess it's how both sides manage the relationship. Yeah, I don't know.
There's a few more questions. 1, 2, 3, 4 at the back there. But as we do that, I'm going to ask you the questions that are coming in from online. And one is to Rehema. Great set of cases and issues. Keen to hear how these empirical cases challenge available concepts of governance. What does that actually mean? What does an institution, what does governance mean in such a context? And I guess to Tinashe, very similar to the previous one, do we have examples of African curated archives? And do they provide a different picture? Do they provide fuller understanding of our history? And then let's have a few more questions from here.
Okay. Can I? Yes, my name is Stefano Bonfa. I'm from Oxford Sustainable Development Enterprise. It's a research organization, a network of research organization. And the question is regarding the infrastructure, big infrastructure in Africa. My question is, we are moving towards a digitalization near all over, let's say, the world, including developing countries. You don't think that what is missing is infrastructure, big project infrastructure is missing the digitalization? Starting to think in terms of planning, digital planning, at, let's say, regional or even, let's say, continental level, in order that you try to understand the infrastructure, because infrastructure is a critical, it's a lot of investment. I have a lot of some elements that link, you talk about connection, link different type of big infrastructure is a risk. Thank you.
Next.
My name is Boyma Rogers, and I have written a few things on infrastructure, and a couple of things. A couple of things came about from the discussion. 2 things actually. One was in China, when you mentioned the non-interference issue, and the other one was in the UK, where you had having to create a framework for infrastructure. Now, my point to you is: has this AfOx thought about having an infrastructure event whereby you could have the various elements of infrastructure, which would include physical, soft, intra-African, and digital infrastructure, so that you can have something to help Africa and looking at all these sort of different infrastructure sort of projects and so forth, because a lot of it, for example, is to do with things like governance. Have you thought of having something to that effect to help in the process? Thank you.
The last 2 questions.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Missos. For 5 years, I've worked in Africa for the Chinese government, for China Development Bank. I was the global head of development and deputy CEO of the development company under China Development Bank. So I know a lot about a lot of projects in Africa. I think the amount of the financing gap is even bigger if we include SDG meeting, right? So we're looking at $300 billion. Most of which is going to have to come from private sources. When we say private, we mean pension funds, insurance companies, asset managers, it's sovereign wealth funds. And they're all looking to make money. So my question to you is, how do we go about making Tanzania or other places in Africa places where private investment, meaning pension funds and insurance companies are willing to take a little bit of their money and make investments. And they know it's riskier, but it's going to make a little bit more money. And that's the question of how to attract these. Without this money, I think relying on bilateral lending and financing from governments is not going to work enough. And the multilateral development banks can only provide a portion of that capital needed.
Show me the money, huh?
Thank you very much. Name is Kayode, I'm Nigerian, so thanks for sharing the case studies about Lagos, because I really do that a lot. But I'm going to send you back to Tanzania, because I've been to Tanzania, and I think in recent years, there's a lot of major projects going on. There's a very elaborate train project going on in Tanzania. But in all these discussions, whether you're in Nigeria or Tanzania or wherever, I think the big part of it is about sustainability, and I think it touched upon it. You know, there's the economic side of it and the financial side of it. You know, how sustainable are all this, and what's your view on that? Is that a lens that you look to apply? And when you've applied it, how do we situate that, you know, in helping our countries or our existing government models move forward to build structures that outlive but do not become important after these guys go? Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to ask for one question from a female participant. In the face of equality, there's been a lot of questions from one end of the spectrum. Could I have one on the? Okay, good. There's take us at the back, and then we'll leave enough room for all the conversations when we have something in our hands.
Hi, so my name is Mandat in Zimbabwe. Very excited to see the whole point snatch here. So my question is around the idea of disrupting the archive as it exists now. Because in my mind, I can shut it out. So basically, my question is, the idea of disrupting the archive as now is almost like
Sorry, we'll just have you say because of the people online.
Okay, so my reflection is around the fact that when you propose or when you challenge us, which I think is good, to begin to rethink or try and disrupt the archive as it exists right now, it's basically a conversation about to what extent does it represent where I'm coming from, where I'm going, where I am right now. So my question is around, as you attempt to disrupt it, how comfortable are you with what you're finding? In what ways is it representative? Because again, you are moving away from something towards something. What does it look like? Because you don't know where you're going. It means that you're creating something, but at what point do you know, like, I have arrived? What does it look like? I think you gave an example of English as a language, because again, it's like you're theorizing, you're conceptualizing based on things, again, that are not representative of you. So I think it's a question of how do we begin to approach it in ways that make us, you know, go towards the right place, because we all don't know what that looks like, but so that we get to a place that at some point someone feels like, it truly feels like this is the African history, this is the African present and future.
Brilliant. Those very simple questions, quickly.
Okay, so what are African curated archives? I mean, I think they're there. They're there in our communities. They're there in the markets. They are there in the ways we live our lives. They're there in the rituals that we use to speak back to our ancestors and all of these things. Like there is a system, and I think archiving it, or terminology or systems, I feel like we just need to figure out what is the language that defines the system. I found it productive to pay attention to what visual artists are doing with history, with archives. So mostly young contemporary African artists. They're doing an incredible work just rethinking what an archive looks like, how to feel an archive. So they're activating the archive for the bodily experience. So they utilize the five senses. And I now do that as a literary person because I was trained to mute my senses and just to read and interpret text textually. But now I insist with reading with my body. And I think, so I think for me, that's why I was trying to even like explain, like sitting in a room in the Western Library or in a room in Texas, you know, my body is aware of where I am. And that disconnect with the material in front of me happens because there are things are not connecting as they should. And I can feel them crawl on my skin. And that's what I'm trying to like interpret. And I mean, I guess the question about disrupting the archive. So this archive that exists, that I'm accessing, that I'm fighting with, is a legitimate archive. It's not my legitimate archive. It is an archive about a moment that happened in history. But what I want is the other characters in that story. And those are the voices I'm seeking. That is the experience I'm trying to trace back. And if it means, I don't know, if it means I have to use ghostly means, I will use them to try and arrive at those characters. There was a story I read about King Lobengula, for example, sending these two emissaries from Matabeleland to England. These two men, one was 75, one was 66 years old. They'd lived their whole lives in Africa, in the bush, in mud huts, and all of that. They were sent to England. They did not speak English. And the story, and this is very crucial to the story of the beginnings of the colonial project in Zimbabwe in 1890 and how the land was taken. And I've spent so much time in the archives trying to find the voices of these two men. And I can't find what their experience was of England in 1888. But anyway, I'll just say the last thing I will say, there have been questions that were not about directed to me as such about like digitizing. So I'm skeptical because digital infrastructure is monopolized by mostly America, Europe, and I find like even platforms like Wikipedia, they're not interested in African subjects. So if you try to include African writers, for example, if they've not been featured on CNN or BBC or The Guardian, they are not considered important because Wikipedia uses what they call a notability index. So all those people, no matter how canonical they are, no matter how important they are to our imaginations as Zimbabweans, Nigerians, Kenyans, Tanzanians, they cannot be on Wikipedia. And now that's become the first port of call for people looking for basic information. But yeah, I think I'll be happy to continue conversation after. Thank you.
Okay, so for the online question asking about governance and institutions and how this challenges existing context, I think the idea of polycentricity becomes important, and the scale of the challenge is central to that, right? So no one party can act alone. This is not at one level of decision making, it's at multiple levels of decision making. And so our ideas of governance and institutions within the infrastructure context, I would argue, are similar to those or the challenges that exist when thinking about sustainable development and the sustainable development goals, right? Which links to the question about sustainability. What this calls for then is new, I guess, novel structures and processes, one, to govern the process, but then also an interrogation of whether the tools that we have to evaluate projects are adequate, right? So do we currently, the technical appraisal methods for projects are very centered on time and money, on value for money, but they don't necessarily take into account adequately the wider benefits or the wider costs of infrastructure projects, destruction to nature, for example. So it's a question of how do we account for those in a primary way and not as an afterthought. Also questions around inclusivity, which was in the definition of major programs, including marginalized people and communities in the decision-making process more than has been done to date. On digitalization, I think it's important, and there is a wide awareness of this. The case of Rwanda, for example, at the moment, I think they've passed legislation that allows for data privacy in order to be able to bring in things like AI and technology, right? I think there is also a question, which is also an emerging topic in the US. I'm thinking about digital ethics, which goes back to Tinashe's point. So it's not simply a missed opportunity that we need to jump on and advance the technology, but we also need to think critically about who we are in the technology landscape, who we are in the technology landscape, and to what ends we are developing the technology. So a huge opportunity, but needing to think about it more critically. China non-interference and creating a parallel regulatory framework, and AfOx hosting an infrastructure forum. Yes, on behalf of that, I think it's important. I think because infrastructure involves so many different parties across so many different levels of decision making, there is value in coming together and convening such a forum. I think it also speaks to the question about North-South learning, South-North learning, South-North learning, and also now East learning, right? So there's an opportunity to exchange in a way that would definitely enrich the research, but could also be beneficial in practice. In terms of private finance, it's critical. So yes, absolutely. What can African countries do? Well, private finance requires bankability. They want consistency in terms of your policy, your regulatory framework, the political climate. They want cash flows. So it's both novel ways of thinking about the financing structures. Perhaps the multilateral development banks are not going to provide the finance per se, but can provide the guarantees, etc. Perhaps again, in the same way as with the Thames Tideway Tunnel in the UK, you create islands of effectiveness, if you will. But ultimately, it also requires that the institutional environment enables that through consistency. And I think that's...
Yeah. I admired you both at this level. I think it's gone over the roof at this point. Please join me in thanking our two wonderful speakers for today. I hope you're all living here enlightened and having thought about something in a way you hadn't thought about it before. And allow me to ask our wonderful Esther to share our little care packages to our speakers for today. And there's a short survey for you to tell us. You create the Insakas. You tell us what you want to hear, what speakers you want to listen to, what interesting ideas you want to bring to the fore, what you want to hear for the next Insaka. So please fill in the short survey. Tell us what you found interesting and what you would like for the next future Insakas. I'm sure there are brilliant ideas in here. And if you want to nominate yourself, please feel free to do so. If you think you can beat that. And the next Insaka is going to be on the 3rd of May. Please block your calendars today. The 3rd of May, we will have another brilliant Insaka, and the topic is a secret for now. So make sure you follow AfOx on social media. Make sure you check our website, and we will update you as soon as everything is finalized, and we can invite you for our next Insaka. Please, thank you very much for making the time to be with us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed yourself, and I hope it's only going to get better once you see what's behind the desks at the back there. Thank you so much for being here, and we hope you guys to enjoy meeting each other at the reception. Thank you.
I think we're lucky.